A mother and son have been sentenced to a combined 85 years in prison after admitting they beat a man to death. The victim was 29-year-old Corey Soules, and at the time of the attack, he was in a wheelchair. Prosecutors say Soules was beaten with an iron pole and that Samantha Watts ran a drug distribution operation using her son to carry out the violence. Now, both have pleaded guilty and are serving decades-long sentences for their roles in Soules' death. I'm Kennedi Walker, and you're watching Law and Crime. It's been 2 years since the body of 29-year-old Corey Soules was found. His body was wrapped in tarps and weighed down with cement blocks. He was found in Gallivants Ferry, South Carolina, about an hour away from Myrtle Beach. Corey had been reported missing just days earlier, and what began as a missing persons case quickly turned into a homicide investigation. Police say the 29-year-old was attacked by a group of people, and witness testimony and video surveillance backed that up. The footage reportedly showed him even losing consciousness during the beating. An autopsy confirmed that Soules died from blunt force trauma, and he suffered 8 to 10 blows to the head. That investigation led to the arrest of several people, including 4 members of the same family: Samantha Watts and her children, Payton, Jonathan, and Amber. Samantha was first arrested on drug charges, but later she and her children were charged in connection with Soules' death. It was revealed that Samantha ran a drug distribution business and controlled her family, using Payton, who was just 16 years old at the time, as her muscle. Prosecutors said that Samantha Watts and her 2 sons beat Soules with an iron pole, and that Soules was in a wheelchair during the assault because he had a broken leg from an earlier attack by Payton. The arrest documents did not reveal a motive. However, prosecutors said Samantha exercised control over her family and orchestrated the assault. Corey had been living in the home at the time, reportedly as an acquaintance of one of the adult children. Now, this week, just before the trial was set to begin, the Watts family admitted to their roles in the murder. Samantha and Payton both pleaded guilty to murder. Amber pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact to murder under the Youthful Offender Act and was sentenced to 6 years suspended release to 5 years of probation. Samantha's other son, 21-year-old Jonathan, pleaded guilty to first-degree assault and battery under the Youthful Offender Act and was sentenced to time served. A judge sentenced Samantha to 45 years in prison and Payton to 35 years. Their sentences are day for day, meaning they must serve every single day imposed. Corey Soules would have turned 31 this year. He leaves behind a wife and 3 children. And here to break down this story with me is criminal defense attorney John Day. John, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's jump right in. When 2 defendants plead guilty to murder just days before the trial, like in this case, what does that timing suggest about what may have been happening behind the scenes?
Right. Well, what it suggests to me, especially when we look at the 2 younger members of this 4-person family that were facing these charges in connection with the murder, the 2 younger members get basically time served, plea deals, or very little time on probation, which certainly might indicate there was the prosecution was able to flip them, turn them into possible witnesses for the prosecution. The mother in the case, then the son, who was 16 at the time of the murder and 18 now, are getting many, many years in prison. Mom's going to be almost 90 when she gets out. The son will be in his early 50s. What that tells us is that they were making a gamble going to trial. They waited until the last minute. They decided this was a better outcome than what a jury trial would have gotten them. So you got to give credit to the prosecution for possibly flipping the 2 younger members to testify against mom and older brother.
This is a Law and Crime legal alert. Did you know that children are being diagnosed with serious conditions like type 2 diabetes and non-alcoholic fatty liver disease? And research is potentially linking ultra-processed foods to these outcomes. Morgan & Morgan is stepping in to fight to hold food companies accountable. With decades of experience fighting large corporations, they're ready to stand up for families who deserve justice. If your child, who's under 21, has been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes or fatty liver disease, visit www.forthepeople.com/food or scan the QR code on your screen to learn more. Given your experience Do you think that this was a good deal? Like, do you think that if they would have went to trial, they could have gotten more time?
Yeah, I mean, that's, they're not going to take a deal like this unless there's some benefit to them. And obviously, the defense team for the defendants had evaluated the evidence, weighed all the possibilities, and said, look, if you don't take this deal, it could be much, much worse. There's, it's not the death penalty you're facing, but it is basically, at least for mom, the rest of her life as an adult in the state prison system. And for the young man who was, apparently identified as the enforcer for this, literally a drug family, he gets to get out. He'll be in his early 50s because under the South Carolina law, they're each doing day for day. They're not getting any credit, not getting out early on probation or parole. So they've got to do the full sentence. But that's what they do with their defense team. They evaluate what the possibilities are, and they determine that, the chances of getting convicted are pretty significant. The chances of us getting an acquittal are slim. So we better go with this deal.
And I'm glad you brought that up. Day to day sentences. If you can explain just more in depth, like what that is and how rare is that level of accountability in plea deals?
Right. Most states have a situation where if a defendant's sentenced for a case, that they're doing a certain percentage of the time, because states often build in good time credit when someone's sitting in a state prison. And one of the reasons they do that is the state prison system wants to have an incentive to have prisoners basically behave when they're inmates in the state system. So it's a carrot and a stick type deal, where if you're an inmate, you know that if you behave, you're going to get time shaved off your sentence. Not happening in this case. In South Carolina, under this plea deal, they're going to do every single day of the sentence. 45 years for the mom, 35 years for the son. So they're not looking to get out anytime early, and they're not going to get any reduction in their sentence. That's part of the deal.
Is this a deal that you think you would have taken if you were their defense attorney? Of course, I know you probably would have had to read over every piece of evidence, but just knowing what we know, because with the mom getting day to day, I mean, that is life, right? Not many people live until 90. And then even for the son getting out when he's about 50 years old. What do you think?
Right. I mean, obviously, and I think it's a good question. If you're a defense attorney in that position, you are telling your client, look, here's how I think this is going to go. Are we going to get an acquittal in this case? No. Are we going to be facing much more time? Yes. What has the state offered? The state obviously feels confident. The prosecutors feel confident in their case. But they're also willing to agree to a deal like this because it doesn't put anyone else through the expense of a trial. No one has to live through that. And it does indicate that there may have been some benefit to the two younger members of the family who were looking at a lot of time too. And now they're basically getting a pretty good deal. One of them just gets time served. The other one gets, I think, a little bit of time on probation. But I think it suggests anyway that the prosecutors had gotten them ready to testify against the other family members in this case, which is really bizarre and troubling and disturbing. The idea that this was literally a crime family, not like we ordinarily think of crime families. It's not like a mafia, a mob, a big city mob crime family. It's a rural, apparently drug connected operation where the mom was running the show, and the younger son, 16-year-old son, was the muscle. He was the enforcer, is what the law enforcement says.
Let's dive more into those charges. I mean, if you could explain what exactly is assault and battery by mob, and how is that legally different from just being involved in a group fight?
Right. And then that jurisdiction, it means that there is basically a group of people who participate in the crime and the violent crime. I mean, the poor victim, who apparently was in a wheelchair because he had suffered a broken limb, a broken leg, inflicted by the enforcer on the family, the 16-year-old the teenage son who was working for his mom as the muscle, as the guy who physically enforced the rules of the family. So the mob charge involves a number of and there are other people who are convicted in this. They're not facing the most serious charges, but there were some other defendants who pled to the mob assault charge. And that just means that there are a number of people engaged in an attack on a victim. So, not nearly as serious as the murder charges, but the idea that this was a group of people all working together in a criminal enterprise, according to law enforcement, it was drug related. We haven't gotten specific information on what the motive was for the killing, but you have to remember that the poor victim was in a wheelchair when he was murdered, apparently, and he was in a wheelchair because of the broken leg inflicted by the son, who pled guilty.
And just more on the son, right? Who was a teenager when he's still a teenager, but he was a minor when this crime happened. Are you surprised that they weren't able to get, I don't know, some lesser charges given the fact of what the prosecutor said of the mom just controlling everything and making him do this and in calling him the muscle at 16 years old? I mean, most 16-year-olds are learning how to drive or they're going to prom, but this one was forced to be in this type of crime family, it appears.
Right, and that's a really interesting part of this, because if you were defending this 16-year-old as a defense lawyer, you'd be saying, look, our defense is that he's under his mom's absolute control. I mean, he's grown up, as her son. He's 16 at the time of this crime. You've got to, if you're defending the case, you've got to be delving into what type of manipulation was the mom exerting over him? What was his role in the family? How much ability did he have to get out of the situation? Had he been sort of raised like an attack dog by mom at an early age? And so what was his culpability? And that makes it interesting that he did accept that this was the plea that his team accepted, because they may have been concerned that there was not enough in their defense war chest to say, look, this guy was just a victim of his mom's manipulation. He himself was a victim. We ought to look at him as someone who had no other options. Mom was calling the shots. Mom had him under her thumb. He was doing the work that mom wanted him to do. So when you're defending something like that, you're going to want to, the card you want to play is, this poor kid had no choice. He had no way to get out of this. He was being manipulated. In this case, apparently his defense team thought, this is the better outcome for us because we don't think we're going to be able to convince a jury that that's going to work.
Would you suggest that he appeals and gets a new team?
Well, if he's making this deal, if he's taking this deal, most likely part of the deal is he gives up any right to appeal. I mean, he can certainly raise issues down the road of things like, did his lawyers, were they giving him the right advice? And those would be more issues related to lawyer responsibility claims. But at the end of the day, you've got to assume that the analysis by his defense team, by the young man's defense team, was, this is the best we're going to get. We're not going to be able to prove to a jury that he was manipulated by mom to the extent that he was not culpable for his own actions. He was not guilty for his role in the murder because, mom was in control and had him brainwashed, basically. So they apparently thought that's not going to fly.
Well, given the range of charges in this case, from murder to accessory to mob assault, how unusual, or maybe it's more common than we think, is it to see a single family involved in a case with such layered legal responsibility?
Right. And that is an unusual situation. I mean, again, the general idea of a crime family tends to be some kind of organized crime racketeering deal, something out of the Northeast or some big city where it's all members of either a cultural group or an association or literal family members, but it spreads out over a number of different areas like, racketeering or drugs or money laundering or prostitution or whatever it is. That's sort of the typical conventional wisdom idea of a crime family. This was literally, in the eyes of law enforcement, a crime family. I mean, it was the bottom line apparently was drug distribution, drug operations, although that's not what they were specifically charged with. But law enforcement has indicated that that's what was going on. So you had mom as the mastermind, you had her 16-year-old son as the muscle, and we can assume that means physically inflicting pain on people for whatever reason, whether they're not paying or they're not cooperating or they're operating a rival operation. And you have other members of the family involved. So it's literally a family that apparently grew up in the last several years with the idea that violence and drug operations and conspiracy to commit these things was part of normal family life. And that's why it's such an unusual case, because normally crime families don't look like the average family in your neighborhood.
Right. And moving on to the daughter, Amber Watts. She pleaded guilty to accessory after the fact. What makes someone legally responsible after a murder happens?
What did this person do? What did the defendant do? What were her actions? What was her involvement? How conscious was she of what was going on? The fact that she gets such a pretty lenient outcome. And so, and for her purposes, it's a great outcome considering what other members of the family were facing. So it indicates either that the prosecutors thought her culpability was so low, or some kind of a deal where she was going to testify about her knowledge of the rest of the family's activities against mom and her brother and anybody else who's involved. So we don't know yet what the motive was for the prosecution to offer that deal, but it just simply was going to reflect the level of her involvement. May have been minimal, or she may have been a key witness to flip on her family members.
Sometimes in these cases, we see things like, once you've been charged or sentenced, you're not able to talk to maybe other criminals or other felons. Do we know, or can we assume that in this case, the family will no longer be able to communicate with each other since mom and brother are locked up and the other two siblings are, either on probation or did time served?
Right. It depends on what conditions the court has imposed. As the court said, you're convicted, you're going to do this sentence. Are you allowed to talk to your family members? Once the case is done, usually those prohibitions go away. But of course, the concept of is there any kind of continuing operation is always going to be in the minds of law enforcement. But it seems like the police agencies involved in this case felt pretty confident that they had shut this down. They had one man dead at the hands of the at least the top rung of the crime family. The people who are most culpable are going away for a long, long time, and whether or not they're going to be allowed to talk to their family members while they're sitting in the state prison, that'd be something that'd be up to the local Department of Corrections. But that kind of stuff is monitored pretty closely. I mean, we're always getting prison conversations that are recorded, prison videos, information after the fact if it involves a new case about what's taken place, what communications are taking place by inmates in a prison system and people on the outside.
Do high sentence plea deals like this help avoid the trauma of a trial, or can they leave victims' families feeling like they didn't get their day in court?
Right. So cases like this, it depends on what the communication is between prosecutors and victims' families. There are some times when a victim's family rejects the idea that there should be a plea. They want to have their day in court. They want to see a defendant on the witness stand. A lot of the times they're hoping for some kind of explanation of motive to give them the closure that they want. And that doesn't always happen. And that can be certainly troubling and confusing for a victim's family if they think if this just goes to trial, we'll get the answers we're looking for. And that doesn't always happen because sometimes, of course, defendants don't often testify in their own trials in cases like this. Sometimes the victims' families are just left with little morsels of information. And there are other victims' families who say, look, we do not want to relive this. And if you can get a deal that puts this person away for a long time, that's going to be satisfactory to us because we don't have to go sit through a trial and have that emotion welling up again, go through that trauma that we've already lived through. So perfectly reasonable answers on both sides. One of the most recent examples was the Koberger case in Idaho, where some victims' families said, we do not want to see a plea deal. Other families said, we are okay with this because we don't have to live through a trial. It just highlights the pain and the trauma of being the family of a murder victim, because on the one hand, you may want justice. You may want to see that person in court. On the other hand, you want to relive that.
Well, how do prosecutors choose which way to go? Whether they, make an example out of this person and they want them, to be tried in front of the judge, or if they would just rather the deal?
Right. At the end of the day, the prosecutors, even though they have a lot of contact with victims' families, and victims in every state in the union now has victims' rights, whether it's encased in law or there's some constitutional provision. Prosecutors are supposed to take into consideration the feelings of a victim's family and the concepts of justice that the victim's families want. Having said that, prosecutors represent the community as a whole, and they will always tell you, while we want to listen to the victims' families, we have to make the decision about what's best in each case. So that's when sometimes you get a clash between prosecutors and victims' families. Prosecutors are looking at the bigger picture, which is what's best for the community, what's the best outcome for us, what's the most likely chance that we're going to get something close to the justice we want. And sometimes that clashes with victims' families' wishes, because if you have experienced the death of a loved one, for example, and you are aggressively wanting to see that person on the witness stand taking responsibility, that may be a goal that you need to help close out that situation. but it doesn't necessarily happen. So at the end of the day, the prosecutors make the decision based on what's best for the whole community. They're supposed to listen to the victims' families, but that doesn't always translate into both parties going in the same direction.
Right. And it's clear that this was a very emotional case. I mean, we're talking about a victim in a wheelchair, so he was clearly vulnerable. Does that impact how a judge or jury, interprets intent or brutality in sentencing?
Right. Brutality is the word in this case because we know that this victim, the murder victim, was in the wheelchair because he had apparently his leg broken by this 16-year-old teenage enforcer for the family. So the fact that there was all this brutal violence that led up to the murder is certainly something that the defense is taking into consideration in determining whether or not we should go to trial or take this deal. But everything about this case indicates that there was brutality, that there was violence, and there was physical trauma involved from start to finish. And one of the reasons they may have taken the plea deal is the concept that a jury would be wanting to punish the defendants regardless, and then they'd be facing a much stiffer sentence, including the possibility of a death penalty in South Carolina when it comes to sentencing. So defense team decided this is the best we're going to get, and their clients, the defendants, agreed.
Right. And then in this case, the victim is leaving behind, 3 children. I'm assuming judges also take surviving family into account when weighing sentencing, especially in plea deals.
Right. And it's at the time of sentencing, that really is the closing moment. That's the moment when victims' families get to court, get to stand up at a podium. They get to address the killers. They get to address the community. They get to address the prosecutors. And it's just an incredibly emotional and meaningful moment when victims' families finally feel like they get their moment in court. They get their time to stand up and tell the people who killed their family member how it makes them feel, what it's been like living with that since the murder, things like that. That's why those moments, those sentencing moments, are just incredibly moving and very emotional.
Right. Well, this is a case that we will be following because there are 2 other defendants that we're trying to see if there's going to be a trial or if there will be a plea deal there. So, John, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thanks for having me.
2 other men, Ryan Porter and Josh Brown, were also arrested in the case. Porter is charged with second-degree assault and battery by mob, while Brown is charged with accessory after the fact. Their cases are still pending. For Law and Crime, I'm Kennedi Walker.